Hello, my name is Ian Moffet. I'm the Program Coordinator Assistant for the Office of International Studies and Programs. I'm also the host of our new podcast called Culture Shock. Now, culture shock is the disorientation one feels when thrusted into a new culture. And we are here talking to local CWU students and faculty members about their experience with said culture shock. And today, we have Dr. Joshua Nelson-Ichido, Professor of Communications here at CWU, to talk about his experience with culture shock. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm excited to be here. As you just introduced me, I'm Josh Nelson-Ichido. I'm in the Department of Communication, and I'm excited to just be here and chatting with you.
Awesome, awesome. Well, to get us started, you, not only being a professor of communications, you were actually a student here.
Yeah, I was. I did my undergrad here at Central a number of years ago.
We don't want to date yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. Geez, what was it? I think I graduated in 2008. I was a super senior, if memory serves. So I should have been out a year or two earlier than that, but I decided to go all complicated and add extra stuff onto my time. Not the least of which was a year of study abroad. So that was part of that.
I'm similar. I mean, I'm like 23 and a junior. I won't graduate till I'm 24.
Yeah,
so
there you go.
Feel a little weird, but it's okay. So let's start off, like, why communications?
It's kind of a funny story. When I came here to Central as an undergrad, I came right in from high school, and I honestly didn't know what I wanted to do. I back then, when you were an undergrad, when you were a freshman here, they didn't want you to declare a major. They didn't want you to declare a major until you were towards the end of your sophomore, or usually they wanted you to declare at the beginning of your junior year, because they wanted people to go and explore the gen ed, go explore ideas and things like this. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought maybe history. I thought maybe English. I thought maybe journalism for a little bit. And while I was kind of exploring and looking around and trying to fill out credits for my, I can't remember if this is my sophomore year or at the end of my freshman year. I think it was freshman year. I saw that there was a Japanese class, the 151, the first in a series. So any of you here who have taken the intro level language courses, they always run 151, 152, 153, typically in that series, fall, winter, spring. But I had taken Japanese in high school, and it was not an intensive course. I remembered the basic alphabet. That was about it. But I went ahead and threw that on there. Like, that might be good just to kind of, because they had it for spring quarter, they had a 151. I was like, okay, well, that'd be maybe a good refresher. And that'll fill out my credit load for the quarter. And that quarter, when I was going in to talk to my advisor, to try to start getting an idea of what major I should be looking at, I told him, one of the things I was thinking is possibly journalism, because I thought maybe I could do something with Japanese, and honestly at the time I was thinking like video games, video game journalism. And they said, well, I mean, I see you're taking this course in Japanese. Have you ever thought about double majoring? And of course I didn't even know that was a thing. I wasn't sure what this was. So they explained it to me, right? You can just get two majors, essentially get kind of 2 degrees or specializations in your time here. And they said, well, if you're going to do that, maybe instead of journalism, just do communication as a focus. And I had no idea what communication was as a general field, because I'd always known it as communications, which is typically like telecom, things like this, and then, or journalism, right? And so I was like, all right, yeah, 2 majors, that's doable. I could just do Japanese and go into that. And so I figured I'd try it out. And the next quarter, I started taking comm classes, like just communication classes. And I loved it. And I discovered it, and I was like, this is it. This is what I wanted right here, looking at not just journalism. This is not me. This is not a slight against our journalism program. Yeah. They're great classes. I never even knew that comm was a field, and being able to get in and explore what that is as a process, learning that it's so much more than just, talking. It's so much more involved, and it's all about this kind of creation of meaning and human interaction and relationships, and really diving into that. And it married so well with my Japanese program that I was doing. it just kind of really sucked me in. So that's how I got into it initially, was just by chance.
I can relate a lot because, well, I'm a PR major.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Again,
know,
that's one of our, one of the department majors for sure.
Yeah, and I did not think, like, going into just comm classes, that it was more than just talking.
Right. Yep.
I did not expect that at all. Some of the funniest classes I've ever taken. You mentioned you did study abroad.
Yeah.
Right. As part of as your time as a student here. Do you want to delve a little bit into that and your experience doing study abroad?
Yeah. So for my Japanese degree, and this, like I said earlier, this is kind of one of the reasons why I became a super senior, or whatever. It took longer to finish my degrees, is because I went abroad for a year for my Japanese degree. I studied at the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. It's one of the partner universities that Central has over in Japan for Japanese second language learning programs. I went over there for a year, and it was wonderful. Students in my classes will always hear about this. Especially my intercultural classes, my COM 302 and COM 407, which is advanced intercultural. They'll hear me talk about this a lot, but it was just probably the moment in my life that I started to just really see a major shift in my perspective. Just understanding what it meant to be in a different culture and what culture was in practice and in action. Being a white heterosexual male in the U.S., I very much have been in that normative position forever, and just like, well, everything's just normal, right? This is what it is, and culture is just like something that's very foreign and out there, and it's not something that applies to my everyday life. But being in that position and being in a place where I was no longer in that kind of dominant, privileged majority position, really started to cause me to understand how culture functions and how it shapes perspective, and how that then ties to my experience and the way I view the world, interact with others as well. And that's all very broad, kind of in that sense. In the moment, I was just like, wow, this is all crazy. This is all new. This is all different to me. But this is all fascinating.
Yeah.
And I really dug it.
Because I spent 2 years in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
I'm half Filipino, and in the moment, it's almost like a vacation, new place, whatever. But then, especially when I got back to the U.S., I did a lot of reflection about my time in the Philippines and how much, why did I act this way, when my family members wouldn't understand something I said, like why I respond this way.
Right.
And now looking back on it, when I plan to go back to the Philippines,
mm-hmm.
I'm going to be more cognizant of the way I act, because, and that was my culture shock. Just like, you don't know exactly what America's doing at 100% of the time. You don't.
Why isn't it the focus of your everyday life?
You don't understand this really specific America-centric policy, and that was just me being pretty ignorant. But it was a good experience to reflect on, like, after I got back. I
was just going to say, a big part of that for me, especially being there, what really drove that is just starting to question why and how I deem something normal. Mm-hmm. Because I remember as a student, and then later on when I moved back there after I graduated, I was there for a number of years, just the frustrations I run into with things like culture shock. A lot of that was driven by why do they do it this way? This is so weird. Why don't they just do it a normal way, quote unquote normal way? And a lot of that question and it kind of exploring what that meant to me. Why do I deem this normal? Why would I expect someone from a different culture or nation to see this as normal? Really went a long way to helping me understand, again, just how pervasive culture is in shaping my perspective of the world, right? This unconscious element of culture that drives my assumptions of what is normal, what is right, what's wrong, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, and trying to then broaden that perspective, right?
So what were some examples when you were there? Like customs, obviously there's probably a language barrier.
Oh, yeah. And that seems like a gimme, right?
Yeah.
Is like language structures, but it's something tied to language. I'll go with that. Within Japanese culture, there are different, kind of different levels to the language with regards to politeness and deference and things like this, depending on who you're interacting with. And you literally change the style of your language depending on things like, are they of a higher power position than you? Are they someone that's above you or below you? And it's tied to this idea of sankeigo, which is literally just meaning to this idea of this politeness in action and language. And for me, especially here in the U.S. and where I grew up, I'm from East Wenatchee. Grew up there. When I was young there, it was a much smaller town. It was not like a tourist destination. It was just agriculture, really. Yeah. And my whole family, they're all rangers and mountain men and things like this. So we're all very simple, hardy folk, right? Yeah. Like, well, why? We don't need to complicate things. And I don't like to talk to someone like they're above me, right? Yeah. And so for me, when I went there and I was like trying to learn and having to learn all these different levels, I'm like, this is so, why? Why would you do this? This is so demeaning. Why would I put myself below someone else? Why should I talk to someone else like they're better than me?
We would call that power distance, right?
Yeah. So that could tie into elements of things like power distance. This idea that the assumption that a difference in power is the norm, right? I accept that as something that's appropriate, and especially for me in my cultures that I grew up in, very adamantly against this, right? With some exceptions, right? Yeah. You listen to grandpa, you do what grandpa tells you, that type of thing. But I wouldn't change fundamentally my speech structure to go into it. And so when I was there, I actively just used basic form of the Japanese language. I adamantly resisted this. And looking back on it, and I changed later on when I was living there, but looking back on it, I know I was able to get away with it because I was a foreigner. And they're like, well, he doesn't know any better. But just to your question, that was a really big example for me, kind of like, why would they do this? It seems so inappropriate. This seems so so demeaning to have to change the way you speak. And yeah, it's a pain in the butt to do it, but I was definitely coming at that from my own cultural perspective, that this is normal and that the way they do it is wrong. But I was in their cultural context, right? Yeah. And that's the issue.
Yeah. So did you meet your wife here or in Japan?
I met my wife when I was studying abroad. So she was a domestic student at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. She was she's Japanese, and she was going there. That was her university, and I met her through one of the other students in my cohort. When we went there, each international student was assigned a Japanese domestic student to kind of help them kind of get their feet on the ground, get things set up, like help kind of just be an assigned buddy to kind of help navigate things when we first got there. And all those students were volunteers. All those Japanese students, they were volunteers, and they got compensated. Like, I think, if I remember correctly, they were compensated with a gift card to the university bookstore to help cover textbook costs. And my wife was, she was the buddy student for another one of the international students. And we met through that connection when we were all going out to do karaoke one day. That's how we met. We actually started dating when we were over there, so we were together for most of my time there, and then when I came back to Central to finish up my degree, I still had another year. For her degree at Tufts, there was the option for her to go study abroad in a country that natively spoke the language she was studying, which was English. And so she opted to come back to Central. Originally, she was planning to go to, I believe it was Canada, was where she was originally planning to go. But because she was dating me and her parents had gotten familiar with me, they encouraged her to go study with me at Central because they felt more comfortable going somewhere where she knew someone. So she always reminds me of that. Like, I lost out on a year study in Canada because of you. So she came and studied here for the year that I was here. She moved back to finish up her degree in Japan after that year, and I eventually followed her back across the ocean over to Japan and started working in Japan for, well, we were there for about the better part of 2 years or so, 3 years, before we came back to the U.S. for me to go to grad school.
And you were working as a professor?
Oh, well, no, I was working as a teacher, but I was working at a language institute over there. English, conversation, business English institute. Institute was the word that's on it. It was an English language school. It was for profit, so it wasn't part of the public education system. I was hired on there. Many people go over as part of the JET program, the Japan English Teaching Program, which is more funded through the government. I was hired on. I applied got hired on by a company called Eon. So I was working with them for a couple of years while we were over there after that.
I did want to delve into, I had my first interview with Culture Shock was with Professor Michael Johnson.
Uh-huh.
And he spent some time in France, and he had partners when he was in France. He also had a partner from Mexico. And he said having a relationship with someone from a different culture, there's just unique differences or issues that may come up. Was there anything like that in your relationship?
Yeah, there's been a lot of just learning and adjusting. So one of the things when we look at intercultural communication is one of my big focuses. My other area of focus in my research, in my studies, in my degrees is interpersonal communication. So looking at relational communication and emotional communication especially. So looking at how these two areas cross over, we see that understanding the unique challenges of interpersonal relationships is really important, especially at early stages. We do see that interpersonal relationships, especially romantic ones, they face all the hurdles and challenges that an intracultural interpersonal relationship. So that meaning people who are from the same cultural background that are building a romantic relationship. But intercultural relationships in this sense also have some additional hurdles, probably something to the effect that Dr. Johnson was talking about in some of those experiences. Because what you're doing here in this relationship is trying to understand the relational norms that each person's cultures are bringing to the table. So just some examples. I share these with my intercultural comm classes when we come to this topic. Are things like displays of affection. What's considered appropriate and in what context, and to what degree are they welcome or seen as appropriate. Here in the U.S., we're not like, hey, make out with your partner in public all the time, because people will be like, oh, that's kind of gross, too much PDA. But there's still an expectation that, holding hands, a quick, kiss in public isn't anything too bad, or walking around with your arm around their shoulders, or if you're, you're a little bit younger, you got your hand in their back pocket and they got their hand in yours. Those are pretty standard in most situations we expect here. But I recall when my wife and I, when we were dating as college students, like when I was a study abroad student there, she was willing to kind of be a little bit more expressive, but there were many times when we were in public where I'd go to give her a kiss and she'd literally pull away. And immediately, especially at that age and in that position in my college, I was like, what's going on? Like, I thought this was a sign that she didn't want me, or she didn't want to be with me, or she was embarrassed to be with me, or she just didn't care for me. And she would just be like, no, not, what are you doing? Immediately, like, what the hell?
And this is what I've heard from people I know who are from like Japan, Korea, China.
The idea that you would do something like that in public is really inappropriate. And, for me, it took especially for someone like me who came from experience of being very affectionate and as I kind of put it, very haptically affectionate. So lots of touch, arms around, hands around, kisses all the time, right? Things like this. Having to not only learn that maybe that's inappropriate in a public space in Japan, but also that her reluctance to engage in it doesn't immediately mean she doesn't care.
Yeah.
Right. And me trying to force that, or trying to force that expectation on her, like, well, if you don't do this, that means you don't love me, is inappropriate as well, right? Because for her, that's a very big ask, or that was a very thing that made her very uncomfortable, because that's not what you do. And this ties into things like display rules for affection and things like that in a given culture, and even different elements of culture like high contact versus low contact, right? What is the norm or what's deemed appropriate by that culture? So there was a lot of navigating that, especially early on in the relationship. Like what are you comfortable with regards to signs of affection, and to what level then does this have to be maintained even in the personal sphere, right? Again, from my perspective, in what we see here in the U.S., oftentimes marketed and kind of shoved down our throat through all forms of media, is that if you're not like passionately, infatuously in love with and hands all over your partner, that's a sign that something's wrong in your relationship, right? And in Japan, which is incorrect, that's just, I'll throw my interpersonal part in here, like that's just so wrong in so many ways to say that is the standard. But just looking at it from the Japanese perspective, there's no expectation that you have to be like all over each other in private then too, right? It's not like that you don't display in public and you display everything in private. There's just much more kind of a muted or reserved expectation for just, affectionate displays. So for me and her, it was kind of finding that medium, or finding where we were comfortable with and kind of explaining those expectations. And, it's not like that is a one and done thing. Relationships are dynamic things. Culture is a dynamic thing. And even with adjustments and experiences, the wants and needs change over time. But that was a big one for me early on, is just exploring those expectations.
I wanted to pivot a little bit into your class, and a little bit more, deeper into COM 302, and what was that advanced?
COM 407
COM
is advanced
407.
intercultural, yeah.
So what do students learn in those classes?
So with COM 302, that's just straight up intercultural communication. That's the one that's also like a gen ed, and that's an elective for a lot of different programs and things like that. And I'm not the only one who teaches it. We have a lot of our faculty get in on that. In the COM department, we have a lot of people who specialize in intercultural. Shout out to Dr. Lee and Dr. An as well, who are big intercultural focuses as well.
Dr. Garcia.
Dr. Garcia's also been teaching it a little bit more recently too. So we're kind of we all come. Oh, and then also Dr. Young Kao as well, because he does it online from our satellite campus too. So it's a big one that we teach multiple times throughout the year, just because it's really important class. And so just in general terms, what we typically focus on in that class and what we want students to kind of start understanding is, first and foremost, what is culture? And I know that intercultural communication is not the only class where you delve into that topic. There are sociology classes, there are anthropology classes, right? There's a lot of different specialization classes and unique focus classes that kind of explore what culture is. But for us, we're really concerned with people understanding what culture is and how it very much shapes those perspectives of what's normative, what's normal, what should be done, and at the core, how that then ties into how we communicate. In communication, really the way we define it here, and in most instances, everyone kind of goes into more specific definitions depending on how they're teaching it, is just how do we exchange meaning between individuals, right? How do we create and exchange meaning? How do we imply meaning? How do we infer meaning? And how is that then based in our cultural consciousness? So what they'll do most of the time in 302, which again is the basic intercultural comm class, is explore that. What are the elements of culture? What shapes culture? Why do we use culture in so many ways to determine and kind of build and shape our interactions? For me, in my classes, I take a very strong kind of basis from social psychological research, looking at kind of social identity building and how we as humans, we're just lazy. Our brains are lazy. They like simple things like categories. I label you as something. And kind of with that basis, we then go and explore how does that impact communication between myself and other people. The basic idea that I see myself one way and I see you as another way, how does that shape our interaction? And then how do we use verbal elements? How do we use nonverbal elements to communicate? And how do we see those things as universals amongst the human species compared to things that are shaped and bounded by culture? And then we go into elements on increasing or expanding our competency in that communication. And one of the big things that's a through line in my class, at least, is this emphasis on mindful communication, like actual conscious consideration of how I'm communicating with other people. Again, as we mentioned earlier, with communication, people think typically when they first hear about it, it's just talking, right?
Yeah.
We're just talking. And even at that level, most of the time when we talk, we're not being conscious in what we're doing or what we're saying. We're thinking very basic. Our brains are being lazy, trying to get through a conversation and predict outcomes and not focus on what's going on. So training ourselves as students to be more just aware of what it is we are doing and saying in an interaction, and then layering culture onto that and say, why am I doing this and how is culture influencing this, and how might culture on that end be presenting hurdles or objects for us to overcome. So that's kind of the big focus in that. And then into COM 407, which and I say this unfortunately because I know that it's important to have kind of variation in this too, but I will say I've absolutely loved this class, this COM 407, Advanced Intercultural. And I say unfortunately in that I've been the only one who's been able to teach this in our department for the last number of years, just because I'd like to see more perspectives come into it, but I'm not going to complain if I get to keep teaching it because I love it. And in that class, what we do is basically take this idea of kind of identity and culture as a shaper and kind of, again, boundary to communication, and explore in-depth issues of power and privilege, specifically usually focused within the U.S. when we explore things like white privilege and normative race privilege as standards for communication.
Yeah, so for both of those classes, you're not just talking about how we interact with like other countries and their cultures. It's with the intraculture, is that a word? Intracultural
communication would be interacting with someone from your own culture.
Okay.
Right.
So you do delve into like the different cultures within the United States, for example.
Especially in 407, in the Advanced Intercultural. A lot of what we do in that class, or what I've traditionally done in that class, is really pushing students to understand, what privilege is as a function of communication or how that ties into it, and really pushing to conceptualize culture as something that's not bounded by nation. We start off, what some of our early readings are exploring how and why intercultural studies have become so just rigidly focused on nation as culture. So like if we talk about this is Japanese culture and this is US culture, but then I ask my students, well, what is U.S. culture that would be present in that? And we problematize this and break it down. So, tracing the history of why has that become the standard, and how might we challenge that, and how does that layer into things like privileged voice and privileged perspective and privileged forms of communication. So the 407 class gets a lot more nitty-gritty. The 302 is honestly a lot more introductory, just because. But the reason it's 300 level class is just because there's so much stuff we have to lay out as a foundation to be able to even jump into the nitty gritty.
And historically, one aspect of 302, I believe, was a study abroad.
Yeah. Ideally. Yeah. I talk about that, and any of my students who have taken that class with me, especially the first couple weeks, I do a whole soapbox quote-unquote lecture about the importance of study abroad, just especially for any student who is from kind of one of those majority dominant groups. And that's the thing, talking about what dominance is and what majority is, and kind of, again, exploring that as a big thing of these classes, but just telling them or talking to them about just how fundamentally useful studying abroad can be. And that doesn't even have to be something like literally go to a full-on different nation. There are, and this is, you're getting a taste of it here, this soapbox thing is, there are sister university programs that Central has where you can actually go and study at other universities in the U.S., just in different regions of the U.S. And even that is something that can be so valuable. And so I do this whole thing, this whole spiel about it. I include just a little bit of like, hey, check out the Office of International Study and Programs website. Here's people you can talk about. Here's some options with regards to study abroad things. And just in recent years, I actually developed my own faculty-led short-term study abroad program over the summers, which unfortunately hasn't been able to run the last 2 years because of COVID, where I actually, it is my COM 302 class. It's my intercultural communication class and my COM 407 advanced intercultural communication class. I do them both together, where I take students to Japan for 2 weeks, and I take them through Tokyo, Kyoto, and Hiroshima over those 2 weeks, and they get the full class experience. We do some in-class work and the readings and all that stuff for the 2-3 weeks prior. And then we just go there for 2 weeks, and they have assignments that they do while we're there, and we have excursions and everything going through it. And I will say 100% that is the best way to teach that class, because not only are they actively learning about these elements, they're then thrust right into a cultural situation where everything they do is interculturally focused. Right? Most 99% of the students who go on that, this is their first time actually being in or for existing for this amount of time in a culture that's so fundamentally different than anything they know, that they're actively grasping onto the concepts we cover in class to help them navigate it. And when the last time I did it, it's very satisfying as an instructor to see, like, when we're on the train going between, going to an excursion in Tokyo, and students are like, all right, so I saw this happening, or this was going on yesterday. Is this tied to this concept? Just to see that, amazing. I'm like, because that's oftentimes it's not something you're going to get here.
Because it's different than just theory at that point.
Yeah, it's practice. And, and to that end, when we're here on campus, I usually try my best anytime I teach at least 302 to collaborate with one of the international student studies programs here on campus, usually the Asia University America program, the AUAP, just to make my students actually have to go into a situation where they're actively interacting with students and people from a different cultural background, and they have assignments based on that. And that's always been nice. It's always been good. I see usually across the board positive outcomes of that and learning outcomes. But it's still not quite the same as just existing and living for 2 weeks in that very intercultural context.
And do you teach the students when they go to Japan basic Japanese so they can get around?
So for that program, it's meant you don't have to have any Japanese background to do it. You can be completely ignorant of all Japanese language to be able to do it. Because I run the program, and anytime we need Japanese for the program to function, I can do that. I've seen that, and rightfully so, I'm happy to see that many students from the Japanese language program or that have taken Japanese language courses, they are attracted to it as a program, especially since they're taking it as COM 302, which is a gen ed. And I've worked with the faculty in World Languages and Cultures department for sometimes this can be a substitute for things. It's not a guaranteed. I don't want anyone listening to think I can do that guaranteed. Josh promised that. That's not what this means. But they come and they become very popular students on that trip because they have at least some basic knowledge, so other students will kind of class tour with them. There's lots of downtime. I built it into where pretty much any day we have an excursion, it's in the morning, so everyone has their afternoons and evenings to go do whatever they want and go explore, because that's what I want them to do. But there are part of the prep. I provide them with basic cheat sheets for important phrases and that they can do. I teach them basic survival elements. Not that they'll have it memorized. I always have them some stuff written down. I have addresses for where we'll be staying, so they can show that to a taxi driver if they get completely lost and get back to where they need to go. But yeah, there's no language requirement. And the nice thing is, especially in Tokyo and Kyoto, the two bigger cities that we're in, a lot of the areas in those cities are designed to be accessible to tourists. So there is a lot of English available. So if people get lost or if they need help and they have no Japanese experience, they can do it. Even in Hiroshima, there's some level of that too.
Yeah, I'd love to go. I've been to Japan. I've been to Narita Airport. That's
yeah.
That's it.
Outside Tokyo. Yeah, that's the big one.
Just as a layover. That's it.
That's all good.
But yeah, I would love to take that class. That'd be amazing.
I would love to get it going again.
Yeah, hopefully. Is there like a timeline for that, or
well,
too close to say?
We're all set to offer it this coming summer. Here in a couple of months. But the problem was it just, even though now that Central's like, okay, yeah, we'll run these programs again, you still have logistical issues with actually getting access to the country. And Japan still hasn't fully reopened its borders to everyone. It's opened it to students, but only students that have like visas tied to universities or schools in Japan. And we wouldn't be doing that. We're autonomous and just we go under tourist visas because we're only there for 2 weeks and there's no reason to do a student visa for that. It's just a whole other process. So when it came, like about 2 months ago, when it came time to actually start collecting dues, when we would have actually had to be like, hey, people, if you want to do this, we need to start paying money, and there was no sign that the border was even going to be open to students, we're like, let's nix it. This isn't, I don't feel right saying pay money for this, even though as of right now, we have no guarantee that the border will even be open to you. So right now, it's again, out for this year. For all intents and purposes, we're planning to just do it next summer.
There was one question I wanted to delve into before we have a closing question here. Going back to like what you learned from your advanced intercultural communication class, where I was talking about like the different cultures like within America, for example.
Yeah.
When you go to Japan, do students learn that there's maybe a different culture in Okinawa as opposed to Tokyo?
Inevitably.
There's nuance at least.
Yeah. Inevitably what they find is that each place has a different feel. And I mean, depending on if they come and talk to me or if usually what it is they'll have conversations with people they meet there. There are lots of times, especially in Tokyo, where we kind of collaborate with like Asia University, the AUAP. So the students will meet college students there, and they'll go do their own thing. They'll go out and hang out or whatever, and they'll talk with the students. But what they'll find is that just the feeling, just the experience in Tokyo compared to the experience in Kyoto, compared especially to the experience in Hiroshima, is very different. And so what that ultimately ends up for them in a lot of their assignments that they turn in, and as I'm grading them along the way, is they just talk about how surprised they are that these were so different, right? Especially for 302, the basic intercultural communication class, this idea of kind of diversifying and exploring what a singular culture, getting away from that nation is culture mindset that, there isn't just one culture for every country. It's really gratifying to see them start to do that explicitly in that experience. And it really drives them. They do see it like, wow, yeah, Kyoto feels so much different than Tokyo. And, when we were hanging out down by the Kamogawa, in Kyoto, I felt so much more casual. People were just willing to kind of talk with us versus in Tokyo, everyone was so kind of like cold and doing their own thing. And then when we went to Hiroshima, everything was so spread out, it was hard to kind of find people to actually interact with, right? And there was a much more sullen experience with us based on what we do as our excursions in Hiroshima. They just kind of reflect on their different experiences there. It definitely drives them to understand that, hey, even in Japan, there's not just Japanese culture, there's variance here.
Yeah, and getting rid of that nation is culture concept is very interesting to me because I know in America that there's a multitude of cultures. The South versus, the Pacific Northwest, totally different.
You got the Northeast, you got the East Coast, you got the South, you got Florida, you got Texas, you got the Midwest, you got everything. Southwest, but, California, Northwest.
Initially, when I think of a country like Japan or even the Philippines, I just thought all kind of the same culture.
Yeah.
But when I was in the Philippines, the South is way different than the North.
Oh, yeah.
I'm assuming, like you're saying, it's different in Japan as well.
Yeah,
And
different dialects too. That was one thing
Yeah.
that some students picked up on while we were there, especially the students who had Japanese language experience. When we were in Kyoto, they would ask questions like, "I've noticed they speak different," or they would ask the people they met there, "Why do you say it this way?" And they were learning a little bit more like Kansei-ban versus Kanto-ban, the different dialects. And I would say, "Oh yeah, there's tons of different ways that you speak. The language varies depending on the region," and they would get fascinated by this. And they're like, "Well, I want to, since we're here, I want to really pick up, Kansei-ban, right? I want to speak that way, and I'll bring that back to my classes." So yeah, understanding just the fact that culture is not this huge monolithic thing that when you enter into, I'm going to go study Japanese culture, that I'm going to learn a given standardized culture. There's going to be variance there, and how that experience abroad really helped. I mean, just language learning in general, and just to learn a culture, that being in that culture is pivotal to this. And that's one of the reasons why you need to be there, is because you need to understand those variances and those nuances and get to the point where you're not saying, well, this is just how they do it, not this is the norm. Really understanding why it is that this is the way that it is.
Seems like a great opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that my 2-week program is not enough to get you to that point, but just study abroad. Again, that is that soapbox. Study abroad. Do it. If you get the chance, do it in any way, shape, or form. But yeah.
And so my final question here for people who are listening from you, what would be the biggest thing people should know when experiencing a new culture? If you could sum it up.
I thought a lot about this, and it's hard to say the biggest thing. I guess, it would go back to this idea of understanding or remembering that what you think of as normal is not a given. It is something that is tied to your culture. So understanding that when you go to interact with other cultures, it's not because they're weird or they've got it wrong or they're abnormal. It's that you are seeing it through your cultural lens, and your culture, your experiences growing up and everything that you've learned thus far that tells you that's weird or wrong isn't some universal truth. It is very much that your culture says that that's not the way to do it. And so when you are going to learn that new language, when you're going to learn that new culture, understand that it's not about identifying things that are weird or different and then just accepting it as weird or different. It's about training yourself to see that as normal. Training yourself to kind of broaden that cultural perspective, internalize those cultural elements of that culture that help you understand and to see it as normal. And if you can get to that point, what you're going to do is really just internalize that other cultural perspective. And it's not a zero-sum game. This is something I say in my classes all the time when we talk about cultural identity development and learning other cultures and things like this. People will oftentimes characterize it, well, if I learn this about that culture, I accept this about that culture, I have to give up something of the similar value or size from my own. And that's not how culture works, right? That's not how knowledge gaining works. You can, even when something from another culture seems so counterintuitive, something that you hold so valuable and so dear to your heart, and it's so different, if you learn about it and you understand how and why this culture thinks of it the way they do, it doesn't mean you have to necessarily 100% agree with it and think it's the right way. But understanding how and why that is normal for them and the function that it serves for them and why that's important for them just helps you better understand the situation, right? So that, I would say that at its core is one of the most important things you can do, is just remember that when you go into that other culture, your judgments of what's normal or abnormal is very much rooted in your culture. It's not that the other culture is inherently wrong or right or weird or doing it wrong. That's your judgment from your cultural perspective. And if you want to truly learn this culture or this language, you're going to have to learn to kind of lean into that and learn why that is not weird or why that is not abnormal or why that is the way to do it for them, because that's going to help you better understand that culture.
So it'd be cognizant of your internal biases.
Yeah. And if by chance any of my students ever listen to this, or they are listening to it right now, being mindful, right? Being conscious of the communication that you're engaging in. So being conscientious of that, remembering that when I'm interacting with someone from another culture, that these judgments are coming from a cultural perspective and they're coming from a different cultural perspective. Being aware of those multiple perspectives and being mindful, paying attention to what we're doing can be a big part of that.
That's great advice from Dr. Nelson-Ichido. That's all the time we have for today, but great conversation. I think a lot of people are gonna learn a lot from this conversation.
Hey, if I can help in even the smallest way, I'm happy to do it.
All right, so that's going to be it for us today. Want to give a thank you to everybody watching, and you can click the link on the screen to check out any of our international programs if you want to learn more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.